Good afternoon. My name is Eduardo Peñalver. I'm the Alan R. Tesler Dean at Cornell Law School. I'm delighted to see you all here for this fascinating discussion of an exciting new book. At the outset, I'd like to extend a few special welcomes. First of all, welcome to Cornell's 14th president, Martha Pollack, who's here with us today. Welcome back to the law school. I'd also like to recognize the Tisch professors who've traveled from across campus to be with us. In addition, I'd like to welcome a number of colleagues and former deans, Gretchen Ritter, the former dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Kate Walsh, the dean of the School of Hotel Administration, and Glenn Altschuler, the dean of the Cornell School of Continuing Education and Summer Sessions, and Fred Van Sickle, the vice president for Alumni Affairs and Development. Thank you all for joining us here today for this discussion of Andrew Tisch and Mary Skafidas' wonderful book, Journeys, An American Story. The book's a celebration of an enduring truth that we Americans, with the exception of the nation's indigenous communities, all of us are immigrants. As the varied stories in the book make clear, our ancestors came here from all over the world, seeking a better lives for themselves and perhaps more often for their children, as people continue to do today. And it may sound trite to say that we're a nation of immigrants, but it's a truth that we seem determined to forget from time to time, and which we Americans need to be reminded of every few generations. And as the first truly American university, Cornell is also a university of immigrants. Ezra Cornell's commitment to found an institution where any person could find instruction in any study included immigrants among those he intended to welcome. And here at the law school, Cornell's earliest classes included students who traveled from all over the world to study law. Our first two graduating classes included several students who came to Ithaca from Japan. And if you think it's hard to get in and out of Ithaca today, imagine what it was like traveling here from Japan in the 1880s. Living Cornell's values is particularly challenging when some members of our community cannot gain entry to the country or cannot risk returning home to visit their families during school breaks simply because of the country of their citizenship, or where members of our community live in fear of deportation. And in times like these, I think it's appropriate for Cornell to reiterate its founding values. At Cornell's law school, we add to those values a special reverence for the rule of law. And this means, among other things, that we have an interest in ensuring that the legal rights of our students, faculty, and staff are fully respected. And with the support of President Pollack and Provost Kotlikoff, Cornell Law School has taken a number of concrete steps to assist the members of the wider university community whose security has been thrown into doubt by recent changes in immigration law and policy. And I'd like to mention just a few of those before turning the podium over to Professor Steve Yale-Lair, who will introduce our distinguished speakers today. Through the law school's Migration and Human Rights program, the clinical faculty here have committed to providing, without charge, legal assistance to Cornell DACA students who've needed help renewing their DACA registrations or who are threatened with deportation, which thankfully hasn't happened yet. In addition, a team of Cornell Law School faculty have counseled dozens of individual students and offered numerous Know Your Rights programs for the wider Cornell community. And I want to thank the law school faculty and fellows who worked tirelessly to make those efforts possible. And now I'd like to introduce Professor Stephen Yale-Lair, who will introduce our guests and moderate the discussion. A member of Cornell Law School's class of 1981, Professor Yale-Lair is actually a double Cornellian, having earned both his undergraduate and law degrees here in Ithaca. He's a universally regarded expert on the nation's immigration law and policy. In addition to many books and articles, he's the co-author of Immigration, Law, and Procedure, a definitive 21-volume treatise on U.S. immigration law. And it's no exaggeration to say that not a week goes by where you will fail to see him explaining the complexities of our immigration system on CNN, in the pages of the New York Times, or hear him on Morning Edition. And that was a triple negative, and I apologize for that. In short, he's always on TV talking about immigration law. At Cornell Law School, he's the co-director of our Asylum and Convention Against Torture Clinic, and also teaches our basic immigration law course. In his spare time, he maintains an active immigration practice downtown at the law firm of Miller Mayer. Please join me in welcoming Professor Steve Yale-Lair.
Thank you. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrew Tisch and Mary Skafidas. Andrew is the co-chairman of the board and chairman of the executive committee of the Lowe's Corporation. He went to Cornell before me. He graduated in 1971. He's active at Cornell still. He's a trustee emeritus, former vice chair of the Board of Trustees, chairman of the Dean's Board of Advisors in the S.C. Johnson School of Business. He's also active at the NYU Tisch School of the Arts and many other organizations. To his left is Mary Skafidas, who is Vice President of Investor Relations and Corporate Communications for Lowe's. She's responsible for leading all investor and public relations and communication strategies for the company. She has more than 20 years of experience in financial communications, corporate marketing, and positioning for public companies. Together, they decided to write this very interesting book, and rather than give you a boring talk, we thought we would maybe have them start with maybe one interesting story each from the book, and then go into sort of a discussion about the book and about immigration generally. So I don't know which of you might want to start with, and what story you want to start with.
Well, I'm going to start, if I may, by just reading a paragraph from our introduction, which kind of sets up the way we approach the book. Thank you very much, and thank you, Eduardo, for inviting us here. We start off by saying the population of the United States is often referred to as a melting pot, a stew of many different ingredients combined and homogenized. We prefer to think of our country as a mosaic, tiles of many different colors and shapes and sizes, which are indistinguishable from afar, but quite distinctive the closer you get. A mosaic is only as strong as its grout, the sand and glue used to bind the stones together. After all, without the grout, which is our shared sense of ideology and diplomacy, opportunity, freedom of expression, and equality, without that grout, the mosaic would only be a pile of stones. And that's really the way that we look at our collective being here in the United States. We are each stones held together by common beliefs. So with that, Mary, why don't you read one of your stories or one of your paragraphs, and I'm going to read one of mine.
Okay, sounds good. I always do what Andrew tells me. So,
can you pull that a little closer to you?
Oh, sure.
He said it, not me.
I'll listen to him as well. I'm fine. So in trying to pick a couple of the stories that we would read today, the first one I wanted to read was in a chapter in the back of the book. It's called The Undocumented. And my aunt's story is in there, but I'm not reading my aunt's because I can't actually get through it without crying. So the woman's story that I decided to read was Julianne Perez. Julianne came here when she was 5 years old with her mother, and she was undocumented for most of her life here. She recently graduated law school, and about a month before the book was published, she passed her bar. And lo and behold, today she is an immigration lawyer. So this is a portion of her story. I got into college, but 2 weeks before starting classes, I still did not have all the money to pay for my tuition. As an undocumented student, I was not eligible for financial aid or grants. As if from heaven itself, I got a phone call from a wealthy woman from my church who heard my story and felt it would be a waste if I didn't make it to college. She sent me a check for the remaining part of my tuition and pledged to help me pay for college for all 4 years. I was ecstatic that my lifelong dream of going to college would become a reality. While in college, I uncovered the power of my voice through activism. I struggled with the uncertainty of being undocumented, but the courage I gained in speaking up about undocumented immigrant rights lifted me higher. There is power that is born when you step into your truth for the greater good of others. My activism in college grew, and it threw me into my first lessons in the world of political decision-making. As in high school, I graduated college with honors for leadership and respect for my community and the school faculty. However, as undocumented life goes, upon graduation, my college bubble burst, and I found myself unemployed and without a legal means of working. Again, I fell into a deep depression, and again I picked myself up by continuing to do volunteer work for others in more dire circumstances. I've learned from my mother that there is no better way to lift yourself out of a finite universe than by doing good for others. What you give with your heart multiplies, expands, and continues to bless your life forward. A month after graduation, it was as if heavens intervened on my behalf again. President Obama announced his executive action called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, for which I qualified. DACA allowed me three things: to cease being a deportation priority, to have a Social Security number, and to have legal work authorization. As soon as the program became available, I applied for it. With a free attorney, I was assigned at a legal nonprofit. Little did I know then that this attorney would not only change my life and my family's life, but also become a dear friend and colleague.
And Andrew, what do you want to read about?
So I'm going to read about, seeing as this evening is Yom Kippur, I'm going to read a story from my rabbi. She writes, so as a Korean, Jewish, American, immigrant female rabbi, I know a thing or two about feeling like the other. Perhaps we should celebrate the other, the stranger. We should embrace what it means to be the other, the immigrant, the outsider. Because if we personally know the soul of the stranger, then the force of that memory is an ever-present bulwark against bigotry, superiority, and apathy. If we can empathize with being a stranger, then we will never forget that that person behind the barbed wire or the wall, that family forced to hide or run, that couple carrying all their belongings on their back, those people of different colors, faiths, or philosophies. We can instead remember and protect and love the stranger because we are that stranger.
That's great. So what motivated you two to think about writing such a book? What interested you in this? Andrew, why don't you start?
I joined the board of the New York Historical Society about 2 years ago. And one of the things we have at the New York Historical Society is a very nice auditorium that we loan out to immigration and naturalization about once a quarter to do a naturalization ceremony. And I was asked by the Historical Society to offer greetings for an upcoming naturalization ceremony. So I prepared my 3 minutes of remarks about my family's history, did a little bit of research, found out a lot of the lore that we had in our family was just lore, exactly that. And as I'm about to give my remarks, I looked out around the room, and like I'm doing right now, and I said, yeah, everybody's got a story. And went back to the office, having been inspired by what I saw. And I said to Mary, and Mary and I had been writing op-eds for a number of years together. I said, what would happen if we wrote a book about immigration? And we started to talk to people and started writing down their stories. And we then said, it's tough to write in somebody else's voice. So we asked a few people if they would write their stories down themselves. And that's basically how we got to where we are. We started asking people, and everybody's got an interesting story. So.
And everyone wanted to share it. I mean, everyone wanted to share it. The response, I mean, we were able to accumulate 72 essays. The book went from inception to printing in 2 years, which I'm told is not a long time, although it felt like it at the time. And very few people really turned down the request. They either turned it down because they were working on their own book or because they had lost that family history. But everyone was excited about the project and very willing to share their family story.
And how did you pick the 72? I mean, you've got a range of people in the book. Some are very famous, some are just average people. How did you decide which ones to include in the book?
We play a game at Lowe's called 1 Degree of Separation. That's what you can play when you have Andrew Tisch as your chairman, as opposed to 6 degrees of separation. No, but we did, Andrew's network is vast. But we also went through and made sure we had stories from every different wave of immigration. We wanted to include stories that were not as happy, people whose families came here initially as slaves, as well as more recent stories that were more relatable to us in this time.
And Andrew, I heard you even got an Uber driver to tell his story to include in the book. How'd you do that?
Just talking to people. I was taking an Uber from Herndon, Virginia to Union Station. I started talking to my Uber driver, and it turned out that his ancestors were from the same part of Ukraine as my ancestors, from Dnipropetrovsk, and that his ancestors came over to America about the same time as my ancestors. But unlike my ancestors, when they got to Brooklyn and his great-grandfather started to get off the ship, the captain of the ship shut the doors and said, "No more off at this stop. Everybody else gets off at the next stop." Well, unfortunately, the next stop was Buenos Aires. So my Uber driver ended up they spent the next 3 generations as Jewish gauchos, as whatever it took to get by in Buenos Aires, until he finally came here as a street musician in the 1970s and made his life. He has 4 children who are all Harvard, no Cornellians, Stanford. But I just thought to myself, there but for the grace of God.
Or the captain.
Or the captain, yes. Though I or any of us, we could have easily ended up somewhere where we really didn't want to be. So that's why we included Mario Neiman in the book.
Mm-hmm. And Mary, you've got 72 people. You have to categorize them in some way. You could have done it alphabetically or by when they immigrated to the United States. You came up with several interesting categories. You called some people changers, other people lovers or rescuers or seekers. How did you and Andrew decide which kind of person should be in which part of the book?
We get that question a lot, and we agonized over this. We put them in alphabetical order, then we put them by country, then we put them by the time in which they arrived here, and we felt like each of those were missing the thing that made the stories unique, which was the people. So we started to categorize the stories by, the main theme or the main subject matter. And Elaine Chow's story ended up in the Lovers chapter because her parents, running from communist China, by happenstance, both ended up fleeing and meeting in Taiwan. So we thought highlighting the theme of each story would be a better way to do it, and people really resonated with that organization.
We couldn't do it alphabetically because we realized, as we had been collecting, that we had Alan Alda and Ashok Amitraj and Ahmed and Arlene Alda, and we had way too many AAs, so alphabetically it would just look funny. So we gave up on that idea, and we looked at chronologically, we looked at geographically, but we really felt that the stories worked when they were mixed together.
And you have a wide range of political views in the book. You've got Elaine Chao, who's married to Senator Mitch McConnell. You have other Republicans and Democrats and people who are not affiliated with any party. Did you do that deliberately to try to make sure that it's not perceived as a political book?
Well, it's not a political book. We want it to be as apolitical as possible, but we really started with the idea that it didn't matter whether you were Democrat, Republican, far right, far left. Everybody had a story that was worth telling, we were very pleased with the response that we got from everybody that we asked.
And we wanted to raise awareness of the issue, and we wanted to really for people to celebrate the immigrant and to remind them that whether you're someone who votes more red than blue, we all started the same way. We all came here from another country.
And speaking of red, I see you had many Cornellians in the book. I was very happy to see that. You've got Pete Gogolak, the Cornell football player from the 1960s, Ahmed Ahmed, Ryan Platt, Jackie Koppel, Funu Maduka, David Harris, and I can go on and on. So did that come into play, or is that just because you know everybody everywhere, Andrew?
Just familiarity. Pete Gogolak's a wonderful story. Pete Gogolak changed the world twice. He came over as a young, a young teenager during the Hungarian Revolution, and the family settled in upstate New York in a town that was so small that it didn't have a soccer team. So he and his brother went out and they tried out for football, and they couldn't kick a football. They just didn't know how to kick it. I mean, you kick it with your toe, you go straight through the football. So they were kicking it sideways, and they were kicking it far, and they were kicking it accurately. Cornell recruited Pete, and Princeton recruited Charlie, and they became the first two side approach kickers. They changed the way the football was kicked. They kicked it a better way. To this day, Pete Gogolak holds the record for the most points scored by a New York Giant.
And he wrote in his book he wished he had patented that style, because he'd be a multimillionaire if he had.
That's right. But then Pete gets drafted by the Buffalo Bills and the New York Giants. And the New York Giants, after he played a season with the Buffalo Bills, wooed him away for $92,000. The outcry was so huge that it led to the merger talks that led to the merger between the AFL and the NFL into one big league. So he changed the world again by being the catalyst to change the way football is played, owned, and legislated.
And then he went on to work for R. Donnelly, so he had a third career that way as well.
Correct.
So, Mary, let me ask you, I mean, you write with Andrew in the introduction, you know, immigrants are sort of mosaic, and we have this grout of shared ideals, and democracy, opportunity, freedom of expression, and equality is holding us all together. Without getting too political, do you believe that that grout is being frayed somewhat these days?
I don't when you actually talk to real people and you don't necessarily look at Twitter or the way comments are taken maybe out of turn by the media. I think when you walk down the block or you walk down your dorm hall and you talk to your neighbor, you know, the pride in being American, the shared culture is still very much there. I think things have been blown out in the media and are being used, you know, to people's advantages, to politicians' advantages. But I really don't think that the everyday person feels that way.
Andrew, do you want to add anything to that?
I think if you look at the numbers, the average American is very much in favor of immigration. And the numbers have been fairly consistent over the years. It's been so politicized, though, and made into such a, no pun intended, political football that it's become a big story. And, you know, some of the things that are happening are not, these are not what Americans do. This is not the way we treat people. But those are the ones that become the stories. And, you know, I'm very troubled about the number of immigrants that are going to be allowed in next year at 30,000 when
Refugees.
Refugees, when it was at over 100,000 in the late 1990s. You know, these are not the way that we do things here.
And I think, just to add to that, last week we hosted here at the law school a talk by Ali Noorani, who's the executive director of the National Immigration Forum, and he did something similar to your book. He went around and spoke to conservative people throughout the United States about their immigration values, to point out that people like immigrants individually. It's just when you think of immigration with a capital I that you tend to get a little bit scared. And he's doing somewhat the same thing as you. He's telling stories about immigrants. And so with that as prelude, I was wondering, Mary, what's been the reaction to your book? How have people reacted to the various stories in your book?
It's been overwhelmingly positive. You know, there is, I have a friend who is a New York City public school teacher, and she teaches in Astoria. In Queens, if you know, it's the melting pot of the melting pot. There's more people from different countries there than anywhere else in the United States. And she said that this would be a great book to be able to share with middle schoolers because they can identify with a lot of the stories in here. Many of these stories end on a happy note, right? These are successful people, whether they're famous or not. And she thinks that would be a great way to help people while they're struggling with their English, while they're not quite where they should be with their math, realize that this person also came from Guatemala and look where they are today.
Let me ask you something. Let me ask some of the people in the room. How many of you were not born in the United States? Just a show of hands.
Let the record reflect about a third.
Okay. How many have at least one parent who was not born in the United States?
More hands go up.
How about at least one grandparent who was not born in the United States? How many have 4 grandparents that were born in the United States? About 5 or 6. So it's, you can see that this is not an old country. Mm-hmm. This is a country where we're constantly having new people come in. And how many people here know people who, a lot of people who have moved out of the United States? You'll find it's very few.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe a few academics here and there, a few investment bankers, but...
Mary, do you have any other stories that you want to share at this point?
Sure. You probably haven't heard of this individual. I'm going to share the story of, or part of the story of Michael Bloomberg. This very unknown entrepreneur and former New York City mayor. So this is the story of his family arrival in his own words. Our family story is very much an American one. Our ancestors were courageous in uprooting themselves from everything they knew, risking ocean crossings and making new homes in a strange new land. They and their families came from ghettos in Russia's Pale Settlement, the area in which Jews were restricted to. Their towns are listed in the Valley of the Lost Communities at Yad Vashem, remembered because the Jews living there perished in the Holocaust. No matter how challenging or dangerous their lives were elsewhere, it was not easy to start over. My parents didn't talk about the struggles their parents and grandparents faced as immigrants, or the persecution they may have faced in their home country. But they did teach us that we had a responsibility to give back to the country that embraced our ancestors and that made our lives possible. I remember asking my father why he was writing a $25 or $50 check, which was a lot of money for us at the time, to the NAACP. And I've always remembered what he told me. Discrimination against anyone is discrimination against everyone. I've tried to live up to his example and the values of my grandparents and my great-grandparents exemplified through my work in public service, philanthropy, and advocacy for a just and humane world. My ancestors came to America at a time when immigration, to my great good fortune, was virtually unrestricted. Those days are long gone, and national security demands that we control our borders. But that does not preclude a reasonable or generous immigration policy. I've worked my entire public career to promote legislation that will allow current and future generations of immigrants to contribute to this wonderful nation into which I was born.
And Andrew, do you want to give another excerpt from one of the stories?
Sure, I'm going to read from a man named Zach Iskol, Cornell graduate who was a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps and stationed in Iraq. He's writing about his interpreter. Abood emailed me that he had headed to Jordan with his wife and daughters. Insurgents had left a severed dog head on his doorstep, a note warned that he and his family would be next if they didn't flee Iraq. And that's when another fight began to get them to the United States. Unfortunately, the U.S. government had no programs in place to provide them safe passage to America. Instead, Many of the interpreters fled to Syria, Jordan, and Kurdistan. With little recourse, I put my uniform back on and traveled to Capitol Hill and began knocking on doors of senators and representatives, hoping that someone in the halls of Congress would do the right thing and establish a special immigration program to provide asylum to those who put their lives in danger in the service of our country. Senators Arlen Specter and Ted Kennedy held hearings on the issue, and Abood and his family received refugee status and referral to the United States for resettlement. Eventually, Congress established a special visa program for other interpreters in Iraq and Afghanistan. The day Abood arrived in New York, we settled his family in a small apartment in Bay Ridge, not far from where my family had settled 100 years prior on their escape from Russian pogroms targeting Jews in Eastern Europe. We then walked through the city. Abood was awestruck. 4 years later, unfortunately, Abood passed away from lung cancer, but his daughters continued to follow in his footsteps. They are NYPD officers. Though their family has already given so much to our country, like so many other immigrants, they feel a deep sense of gratitude reflected in their continued service.
And in that regard, there is a program now nationally called the International Refugee Assistance Project that helps people like Abood who are served in Iraq and Afghanistan get this special kind of visa. And Cornell Law School has a very active chapter, has been doing a lot of those cases here. So kudos to all of the law students and the people who help them out in those pro bono cases. With that now, I'll open it up to questions, and I'll also repeat the question because this is being recorded. And while we're waiting for people to think about their question, I'll ask the first question. Either of you, what would be like the most surprising story, thing that you didn't expect when you started saying that someone was going to write for you? Mary?
Well, I was surprised that so many people said yes so readily. But I think for me, maybe growing up, I'd forgotten a lot of what my family had gone through. And so the emotion kind of all came back when I started writing my aunt's story and reading other stories that were so similar. It was really surprising. It was kind of like it was bottled for 20 years and it all came out.
And I know for you, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but your aunt was undocumented and died undocumented. And I think many people think of the undocumented as sort of a recent phenomenon, but we've had people who have been undocumented for over 100 years here. And here's somebody who struggled and basically lived her entire life and never got legalized.
It is, and it was, we were trying to cover immigration from every story, and we tried to get folks that were undocumented now to write stories, and they were all so scared they wouldn't do it. So it's kind of like gallows humor. I was like, well, my aunt's dead. They can't do anything to her. I'll write her story. But again, it was surprising. It took me back, the emotion that came up as I started writing it.
Andrew?
I think the thing that amazed, that I don't want to say surprised me, but the thing that was driven home to me was the difference in emotional response from African Americans who came over as slaves versus those who didn't, versus all others who came here voluntarily. And I was amazed at the depth of feeling. And when you read these stories, these are all great patriots. But you could see the raw emotion that where so many people, for so many Caucasian and others, the coming to America was the great event in their family's life. For African Americans who came as slaves, coming to America was not the greatest event in their life. It may have been something else, but getting here was so painful. It made me much more aware of the difference between the two.
Great. Questions? Yes, back there. Let me repeat the question for the recording. What is the role of institutions, community or otherwise, in helping immigrants assimilate into the United States? And you've got a whole ending part of your book about institutions.
And the institutions have played a key role. And we look at three of them in our book, but they really played the key role in helping to set up the social services, originally almost on an ethnicity by ethnicity basis. We had Catholic charities, you had Irish groups, you had Jewish groups, Chinese groups. Each one took care of their own. There are more universal groups today, but they are all very, very important in helping the new immigrant establish themselves when they get here. The easier we can make it once they're here, the better off they are, the better off we all are.
I think when we were researching the book, someone had told us that Catholic Charities and UJA, United Jewish Association, were both invited to celebrate their 100-year anniversary. And really, but the inception of both of those, and this was about a year ago, but the inception of both of those was really, they were started to help immigrants that were either Catholic or Jewish coming over to help assimilate into New York and the other parts of the United States. So we thought it was a very fitting end to the book. And my cousin, who I talk about in the book, he's an American citizen, he's a mechanical engineer. His family had decided to move back to Greece, and he's been living in Greece for the last 20 years. And you know, Greece has become now, its economy is untenable, right? You have a lot of people, I think 30% unemployment and growing. So he decided to move his family back here. And the services that are offered today are just as good and just as plentiful. So it's not like there isn't support for immigrants, but you don't see that mentioned in the news media as often.
And a lot of these organizations did start about 100 years ago because, as the New York Times reported last week, immigration was at a high in about 1910 to 1917. Then we enacted the Immigration Act of 1917, which imposed major restrictions on immigration. So we had a really deep decline in immigration through the 1930s, and it was only after World War II that we started to see an increase in immigration again. And now we're at the same point in terms of annual immigration levels to the United States that they were in the 1910s and 1920s. So the need for such institutions to help immigrants is just as great today as it was 100 years ago.
The Immigration Act of 1917 was also known as the Asiatic Bard Act. And it was designed to keep Asians out, so where the Chinese labor would be imported to build the railroads and build the infrastructure of this country, very few visas were given to Chinese women because it was particularly motivated by the people of California. You know, they did not want too many Chinese in California, and they would rather that the men go back to China to get married and have children.
And indeed, it was not until the Immigration Act of 1965 that we removed those racial barriers, and as a consequence, you started to have more and more immigration to the United States, and now actually immigration from Asia is outpacing immigration from Mexico and Central America for the first time.
Right.
Next question. Yes. So the question was about why did you include a story about a Native American in the book?
I think
He named that chapter. Can you tell he likes Western movies?
we thought it was the right thing to do. And there, we thought about who we missing in the book. We tried to be as inclusive as possible. I will tell you that we tried very hard to find a Japanese American who had been interred in World War II. We wanted to have a story from one of them, and we just couldn't find the right story before we went pencils down on the project. But through the New York Historical Society, we found Ray Halberter, and he was very happy to tell his story. And you can see the pain of what he has endured, what his people have endured all these years. These are not simple stories. They're not all happy stories. They're very complex. And while we wanted to celebrate immigration, we also wanted to bring out as much as we could about the whole immigration issue in 200 and some odd pages.
Next question, yes. So the question is, there's a lot of misinformation about immigration these days, and how is your book trying to counteract that? Mary?
We were talking before this talk about misinformation about DACA. The two counter arguments, let's say, that I've heard about DACA is, well, what would stop any parent from putting their child on a plane and sending them to the United States then? So if anyone here is a parent, you would never do that, regardless of where you lived. And there's also this, people are mixing up kind of the gangs that we hear about in the news, and that this is what happens when you give people DACA status. So we were actually asking representatives from the Cornell Law School if there was, they said they have a site that lists a number of organizations that help people get involved. So we were thinking we were going to post that on our site, because we get the question a lot, how can I get involved? So we're going to start by sharing that. We're also going to see if there's a way that if anyone has gone to a swearing-in ceremony or naturalization ceremony, it really changes the way that you view immigrants, the way you view your own ties to the United States. It's a really emotional and uplifting experience. And if there's a way we could get our public officials to actually, for it to be mandatory for them to attend it, I think it would open up a lot of the conversation, or change the conversation around it.
And just to follow up on that, at the law school we have a Migration and Human Rights Program, and if you just Google Cornell Migration and Human Rights Program, it'll take you right to the website where we list all these organizations that are doing great things on behalf of immigrants, including here at the law school, of course.
I think just having the conversation, and making sure that people are talking about it is a first step, and not just watching what's happening on the evening news and wringing your hands and saying, gosh, we should do something about it. It's having the conversation and then figuring out what it is you can do about it. It's a good first step.
Question. Is there any story that you researched that you decided not to put in the book? Is that the question?
There were a few. I must tell you, there was.
My favorite one was someone sent in their family recipe for moonshine that was passed down from their ancestors. So we thought that was probably not a good story to include in the book.
There were a few, but it was tough to turn down a story that came in that somebody had spent so much time and effort working on. But there were a few that we felt we needed to turn down for various reasons.
They'll be in your next volume, right?
Volume 4.
That's right. Over here. Yeah, let me take a crack at that one. Yeah, so the question was, what's being done about the children who are separated from their families? How many are there, and how many have been reunited? There are at least 2,500 children who were separated from their mothers in the months of June and July before the Trump administration reversed its policy. About 700 of them has still not been reunited. The administration claims that their guardians or parents have some criminal background or other problem to reunite them. So there is ongoing litigation on regarding that. There was a partial settlement that came out last Friday that the parties are reviewing, and if it's approved, it would mandate that the government work more actively in conjunction with pro bono attorneys to try to find the remaining parents and reunite them, if not with their parents, then with someone else so that they're no longer in detention. So it's an ongoing controversy, and we'll see whether the parties agree to the proposed settlement and whether the court then agrees to what the parties come up with. Yes? So the question is, how do we decide which people should be allowed to immigrate to the United States? And if you're going to do it on merit, what is the definition of merit? Nice, simple question, Andrew.
So it's a great question, and I want to think about that one because you're right. You're right. The people come here with different skills and for different reasons, and most people have great merit. And I need to think more about how you would do something that's so radically different in the way you do it. And the problem is that then you have to deal with a bureaucracy in order to do that. And bureaucracies will destroy any good idea quickly. So the question is, how do you make it bureaucracy-proof? I mean, I could select a great country from
your 72 stories.
From my 72 stories. But then, how do we pluralize that so that we've got enough people doing it the same way that we end up with the right thing? One thing I can tell you is that taking young PhDs and sending them eviction notices rather than confiscating their passports.
So that they would stay here.
Make sure that the people that come here and get great educations. I mean, 40 of the 50 best universities in the world happen to be based in America by the latest poll. And we are taking great young minds and evicting them. It's nuts. That's just crazy. But making sure that we have the right people who, first of all, come here, but secondly, stay here. That's the important thing that we've got to figure out how to do right.
Mary, do you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to say, I thought that was an excellent question. I think there's a rational side and there's an emotional side. And I think when you're dealing with people, how do you marry the two? Because you can't take the emotion and the humanity out of the equation. And I don't know if we'll figure it out, but I think you have to give some credit to people who actually took the step to come here. Not everyone is fleeing to the United States. I think that takes a lot of courage. They should get some brownie points for that.
And just from a comparative perspective, other countries do have different ways of selecting immigrants. Canada and Australia, for example, have point systems. But even their point systems include characteristics such as family in their particular country. So it's not just education and ability to speak the language. And Senator Kennedy's aide once told me, people don't come just to work or just for family reunification. People come, if they're selected on economic, they bring their families. And if they're selected on family characteristics, they're coming to work. And so you have to have both sides of the equation to have an effective immigration system. So I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll conclude. If not, let me wrap it up by saying that Andrew and Mary will be back in November. They'll be speaking at the Trustee Council alumni meeting, and there they're going to do a panel discussion where they'll be interviewing Cornell students about their own immigration experiences.
Just Andrew.
Oh, just, okay. Well, maybe you can come too.
He gave me the day off.
So if you want to hear more about this, come back in November. Also, Cornell Law School is hosting a conference in New York City on Friday, October 5th, about DACA and what the status of those people are and what the legislative prognosis is. So if you want to learn more in particular about DACA, feel free to come down to New York City, and there'll be information on the website soon. With that, I'll turn it back over to the Dean.
So I want to thank our authors for for joining us, for writing the book, and for discussing it with us today, and our wonderful moderator, and all of you for your thoughtful questions. The authors will be, we're going to sign right here. Okay, so they'll be up here to sign books, and you should have all received a book. If you didn't, there are more in the entryway. But please join me in thanking them for such a great discussion.